For those of us who had the good fortune to work for the Appalachian Mountain Club in the Huts, the experience enriched us in many ways. It helped shape our personalities, and for many, it shaped and guided our careers. The hard physical work of packing, the daily chores of reaming the hut, cooking for huge crowds of hungry hikers, and answering their seemingly endless questions were tempered by the camaraderie we shared during raids, pack day excursions, and days off. At the annual Fall Fest reunion in November of 2018, a crew member from each of the decades, beginning with the 1940s, shared anecdotes and memories of their time in the huts. It was an evening of reflection punctuated with frequent laughter, where we looked back and took note of how much had changed and how much had stayed the same in AMC huts.
So, for those of you who have not met me before, my name is Miles Howard, and I worked in the huts from 2007 through 2011 in the summers, as well as quite a few caretaking seasons. And the 2000's were a wild and seismic time. And thinking about how to characterize that decade, what I thought I'd do here is a bit of history, but really an ode to a certain era in the huts. And, we all have our hut's origin story, thinking back to how we were introduced to this unique ecosystem. And mine began in the 90s, actually, where we just were at Lonesome Lake Hut. I was 6 years old. My father and I were eating cakers and cream of wheat in the dining room there. And the huts had been recommended by a friend of ours, pretty much. That was our intro. And the first time I remember seeing a live crew member out in the field was a young woman, part of the Lonesome Crew, with curly hair, performing the infamous solo BFD. It was it was a riff on one of those ESPN workout shows that you saw back in the day, and she played all the parts. She also did all the commercials. The transitions were seamless, and she even performed the soundtrack with the help of a kazoo. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen in a food establishment service, and I loved every single minute of it. Why? Because above all, the crew member I met looked like she was having the time of her life. Way more fun than anyone ought to be having in the middle of the woods, serving pancakes to a bunch of strangers in the forest, before 8 a.m. Some years later, once it became clear that the world was not going to explode with the start of the new millennium, a number of us who were sitting in this room tonight decided that we'd toss our name in the AMC seasonal hiring hat. And when we were summoned to Joy Street in Pinkham Notch, what many of us realized was that eccentricity and irreverence, just like I'd seen in Lonesome, and not normally bullet points on any job description, were quite welcome here. I realized this when Mike Couts asked me what my favorite movie I'd seen recently was. I said The Thin Red Line, and he asked, "What do you think of the way that Terrence Malick uses tracking shots?" Whoa. I wasn't alone in getting caught off guard here in the process of being interviewed. A colleague of mine, a man who goes by the name of Johannes Grieshammer, who some of you may know, I just saw him out in Reno the other week. Johannes told me about his interview during our inaugural summer at Lakes. He showed up for the meeting, and within minutes, Johannes and Unit 28 were shooting the shit about the science of ale yeast and Bavarian lagers. When Johannes finally stumbled out of the interview an hour later, the first thing he asked himself was, "Did I just spend my interview for the AMC Huts talking about beer?" We didn't realize it at the time, but what the bosses were doing was appraising our peculiarities and our passions. This was not only a measure of how comfortably we might coexist in a sweat-crusted bunk room after dishing out 93 full-course dinners, but also how we might entertain and engage the guests. That's what hooked me, after all. It's what hooked many of us when we first clomped through the doors of a hut. And so as we kicked off one season after another, we were granted a license to be weird. We had clown-sized shoes to fill, of course. We were hardly the first generation of hut kids to indulge in strange behavior like setting non-dairy creamer on fire with a blowtorch after hours, or serving a Jackson Pollock-inspired raspberry chocolate cake to a table full of burly cigar-chewing men. But there was something special that fueled our creativity, and that was the 2000s themselves. What kicked off the 2000s? 9/11. What followed? 2 wars, the mainstream debut of the term climate change, a housing bubble and a recession, America's first black president, revolutions across the Arab world, the long overdue rise of electric dance music in America, and up here, at the end of the decade, the raising and reconstruction of Madison itself. These were seismic times. The ground was shifting. The future suddenly seemed up for grabs. Anything could happen. At least, that's what it felt like at age 20, even up here in the splendorousness of the whites where everything seems frozen in time. This sensation of buoyancy imbued us with abandon. In the huts, we became our wildest, most adventurous and experimental selves. It was like Paris in the early 1900s. Dinners became an opportunity to dress up in our finest day-glow suits and assless chaps, and to craft things that guests could gawk at before wolfing them down. Why serve a plain old chocolate cake when you could carve one up until it resembled a hillside and cover it with gummy bears to recreate the Battle of the Bulge? When writing the menu, why call the soup potato dill when you could label it Vernal Vichyssoise with a fake endorsement from Karl Lagerfeld? And that was even before we got to the BFDs. You've never really seen a BFD performed in a hut until you've watched Ben Egan descend from the hole in the lake ceiling, shirtless, long hair dangling, a small dog tucked under his arm. The skit was a reenactment of Silence of the Lambs with multiple acts. Ben was Buffalo Bill, naturally. The crew, I'm told, spent hours laboring over how to perform each scene and segue to the next one. This is the same caliber of craftsmanship with which Caroline Wilmington and George Heinrichs developed character backstories for the cast of Marriage Counselor, a BFD that I'm told has since been retired from the hut system. It was fun while it lasted. The guests, not to be forgotten here, were often as much a part of this debauchery as we were. During the now defunct power raids, the guests would alert us to the approach of the raiders and get good seats before the melee began. During my final summer at Madison, more than a few of them stumbled across our secret strobe-lit dance parties in the freezer shed and joined the fun. We sent their comment cards down to Pinkham every time. When several of the OH in this room tonight schlepped up to Lonesome on a snowy night in 2012, a joint Thanksgiving with over 70 combined guests and crew filled the hut with steam, laughter, and turkey skin. It was the best. It was also a mistake. As I later learned, a few of the guests had not enjoyed sharing the hut with a horde of raucous crew members. As the host, I had screwed up. Most of us had at least one experience like this during our time in the huts, where we took things just a little too far. It's bound to happen in any place as eclectic and autonomous as the huts. But what I find myself reflecting upon these days, just as often as the irreverence of the huts, is the bandwidth we were given to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to become better people. I cannot begin to express what a privilege and rarity this was. I learned this shortly after leaving the huts and entering the workforce in Boston. By then, the 2000s were over, the future was not quite so bright, colleges were spitting out more graduates than there were jobs, competition was fierce, and so were the stakes for those of us lucky enough to be employed. One screw-up could spell the dissolution of your career and your professional ascendancy. At least, that's what it felt like. But the huts were there for us. They indulged our curiosities, they enabled us to let our freak flags fly, and they provided the perfect ecosystem in which to fail and grow from it. The huts promoted solidarity and empathy between the crew and the guests. Since the 2000s, many of us who worked in the huts back then have adopted livelihoods that also bank on solidarity and empathy, as well as the creativity that the huts are famous for and somehow manage to tease out of all of us. But we all practice these things in our lives, however we can. These things are very much needed right now in America. And this is why when people refer to the huts as outdoor recreation facilities, it sounds like someone describing, well, it just doesn't do it. The huts are the embodiment of a certain way of being, of relating to the people and the world around you, to a certain kind of love. And once you've had a taste, you can never really go home again.